The title of this presentation is An Ecclesiastical Affair. It concerns events that took place in the industrial village of Pensnett on the western edge of the Black Country in 1870. I came across these events as I was doing some historical research on the area, which is where I was born and brought up. It's a story that's both sweet and sad, sordid in places, silly in places, but I hope it will be of some interest to all who are listening. It actually forms part of the ebook that I've written called Kingswinford Manor and Parish, New Chapters from the History of Kingswinford, Staffordshire. And I'll say a little more about where you can get that ebook at the end of this presentation. As I said, Pensnett is in the western edge of the Black Country, southwest of Dudley. It's essentially an ecclesiastical creation of the 1840s that was set up to serve the spiritual needs of a growing industrial population. In 1870, it was crisscrossed by a number of canals, a number of railway concerns of different types. Indeed, it's quite famous as the place where the engine, the Agenoria, ran for its 50-year life that can now be seen in the Science Museum at York, the Railway Museum at York. There were many coal mines in the area, shown there by the black circles, and these were served, of course, by the railways and canals, and the coal from them was used in the local industrial concerns, very typical of the Black Country in that regard. In 1882, a little later than we're thinking about, but there were a number of major ironworks in the area. Perhaps the largest was the Earl of Dudley's Round Oak Works, just to the east of Pensnett. There were a large number of brickworks in the area too, taking advantage of the extensive clay reserves. And there was the inevitable industrial waste. In 1882, there were a huge number of disused pits around the area of Pensnett. And scattered between all these industrial concerns, there was significant residential housing. In many ways, it was quite an extraordinary landscape. But as industry developed in the area, so too did the normal society develop. There were a huge number of public houses in the area that served functions of meeting places, places where various organisations met, including early friendly societies. There were a couple of schools in the area, the National School and the British School, and we'll be hearing a little more about these later in the talk. The National School and the British School both moved site during the course of the 1870s and 1880s, and both, in fact, still exist in one form or another, either as St Mark's Church of England School or as Bromley and Pensnett School. And there we have a picture of St Mark's. In many ways, the systems used in these two schools were very, very similar. They were the pupil-teacher system with a master and a mistress and a lot of pupil teachers, teenagers who taught the younger children. The National School used the Bell system of education. The British School used the Lancaster system of education. They were very similar to the outside observer and almost indistinguishable, yet there was very considerable animosity between the two setups, largely because the national schools were the child of the Anglican Church, the established church. The British schools tended to be favoured by the nonconformists, and indeed in Pensnett that situation prevailed, and the British school was actually, in the first instance, in the schoolroom of St James Methodist Church, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment. The place, Pensnett, had a number of nonconformist chapels of all sorts and branches of Methodism. As I said, the one that enters into this story is the St James Methodist New Connection Church, and we can see a picture of it there. There were two Anglican places of worship, the major place at St. Mark's Church, and there was also a smaller mission church. And it's with St. Mark's Church that this talk is primarily concerned. St. Mark's Church was built in 1849 on land donated by the Earl of Dudley, or who was to be the Earl of Dudley, William Ward, shown there both in a proper photograph and in caricature. It was built on top of a hill in Pensnet, Barrow Hill, and the gift wasn't perhaps all it could have been, because the land underneath the church was undermined by extensive mining, which caused problems later. It was a grand church, indeed it still is a grand church, and the commentators of the day suggested that it was really rather too grand for the sorts of person who might be expected to worship there. As with every church, it had vicars. They were called perpetual curates in those days. The first was Francis Fowke, who was vicar from 1849 to 1856. Then Richard Flint Brown Winslow, who was vicar from 56 to 58. Richard Winslow actually was the only vicar of Pensnet to have died in office. Neither of those two really concern us. Our story begins with Richard Webster Booth, who was vicar from 1858 to 1867. He was married to Charlotte and he had one child. He was trained at St. Bees Theological College in Cumbria, on the coast of Cumbria. In 1861, he appointed himself a curate, one William Henry Hyde. And we read in the local press that William Hyde was charged with the indecent assault of a choir boy, and most of the evidence was not fit for publication. We meet William Henry Hyde in later censuses as a clergyman without a living, so presumably he was acquitted in some way. He doesn't really enter into our story except for setting the tone to some degree for what was to follow. The next scandal concerned the vicar himself. In 1867, Charlotte Booth charged her husband with adultery with Eliza Brinton, and she petitioned for divorce. Eliza was a nursemaid at the parsonage from 1863, when she was aged about 13 or 14. When Booth left Pensnet, she also left the parsonage and accompanied him on trips around Britain and indeed in Europe. They passed as father and daughter, allegedly sharing the same room in hotels, and on one occasion in Havre, we see a picture there, the same bed. Affectionate letters were produced between the two of them during the trial for adultery. Eliza Brinton herself gave evidence and claimed that no impropriety had taken place. It was recorded that the judge said that if Booth were guilty, it would be an outrage that he, a clergyman of the Church of England, should put into the witness box the girl he had seduced and obliged her to commit adultery, to commit perjury. It took the jury 5 minutes to return to the courtroom and declare that Booth was guilty, and the decree of divorce was granted. The next vicar who was left to pick up the pieces was Charles Atherton. Atherton was actually curate in Pensnet from 1864 to 1867, and he became vicar when Booth left the parish in 1867, and it's with him our story is mainly concerned. Charles Isaac Atherton was born in 1839 to Samuel Atherton and Anne Booth, note the name, in Nottingham. It's possible that he was a relative of Richard Booth, but I haven't been able to establish that. His parents were well-to-do. Samuel Atherton was a lawyer, and Booth had her own shop business. He married Selina Mallet, who was from a family of lacemakers. And when they were in Pensnett, they had 2 children, Ernest and Gertrude. Charles was a pupil at Nottingham High School and then at St John's College, Cambridge, where he took his ordinary BA degree in 1863. He was ordained in Ely in that year and then ordained priest in Litchfield in 1864. He was curate in Pensnett from 1863 to 1876. During that time, he wrote a little book that is still obtainable called Nature's Parables, where he used the analogy of nature to explain some of the Christian truths. His 1907 obituary says, "The immediate occasion of Charles Atherton's first interest in mission work was a sudden death from a stroke of lightning of a godless parishioner, which made a great impression on the collier nature. Mr. Atherton seized upon it and used it as the starting point of a remarkable spiritual revival in the parish. A great love of souls henceforth possessed his heart, and he went forth on mission enterprises far and wide." At Pensnett, he was apparently under the influence of Richard Twigg, who was vicar of Wednesbury, and here the lifelong friendship with George Bodie, the famous missioner of after years, who is still spared to us, was formed. Richard Twigg and George Bodie were in some ways dangerous friends to have. St James Wednesbury was a centre of Catholic evangelicalism, and they mixed high church liturgical worship with social concern. They were censured by the bishop, both for illicit low church practices, for holding prayer meetings in the homes of parishioners, and for also high church tractarian practices, such as crosses and candles on the holy table. It was tradition at the time to preach a New Year's sermon that was really a review of the year. And in his 1868 New Year's sermon, in which he conspicuously doesn't mention his predecessor at all, we read that he wrote, "It appears that those who have been loudest in the praise of the choir and in their desire that a choir fund should be established are those whose names are not found on the list of subscribers to the fund. I would venture to remind some of those who appropriate seats in the church that, by not subscribing either to the schools or the choir, they are absolutely doing nothing for the church. They are having their religion at a cheaper rate than they could have it anywhere else, and they are taking up room that might be better occupied by many families who are waiting for sittings." A young clergyman in his 20s tells his parishioners that some of them are basically a waste of space. Over the years, many Anglican clergymen have no doubt felt the same, but I doubt that many would actually have said so from the pulpit. It being the 1860s, there was a response, but this response was in the local newspaper, the County Express, of Saturday the 18th, 1868. "We sincerely trust that should it be the privilege of the incumbent of Pensnett again to address his parishioners, to remind any of their errors and delinquencies, that his language may be couched in terms more measured and courteous, and in a spirit less rancorous and bitter, and more in harmony with his profession as a minister in holy things. I am, sir, yours truly, Alpha." This too attracted more letters to the County Express, and the correspondence continued for a week or so. The other main protagonist in our story is a young girl, Agnes Boggler. Agnes was the daughter of a shopkeeper in Bromley in Pensnett. She was born in 1855. In 1870, when the events take place, she was a pupil teacher at the National School. She was the 7th of 8 children. At some stage in the late 1860s and in 1870, there was some sort of attachment formed between Agnes and Charles. But we know that this attachment came to the public eye in the 1870s, in 1870. And it came to the public eye primarily through this gentleman, Cornelius Chambers. Cornelius was the steward of St. James Methodist New Connection Church, which is actually sort of across the road from St. Mark's Church. He was a leader of the teetotaler movement in the parish. On March 3rd, 1870, Charles Atherton and Agnes Boggler took a trip together, somewhat illicitly, by train from Dudley to Birmingham, where they went to watch the circus. Unfortunately for them, they were observed by Cornelius at Dudley Station. A little further up the line, for those of you who know it, they were required to change trains at Dudley Port Station, and there we can see some more modern pictures of Dudley Port Station. Unfortunately, they were again observed by Cornelius. The train duly arrived at New Street Station in Birmingham, which is a very different station to the one we know now. And there Cornelius got off the train and followed them. He followed them around Birmingham as Charles and Agnes walked around Birmingham, going into tea shops and other shops, and then back to the town hall. First of all, up Corporation Street, there we can see him again. And then he followed them up Bull Street into Avery's refreshment rooms. And here we read that he had to hide in shop doorways to avoid being seen. He then watched them going to a jeweller's shop, following closely behind them, and saw Charles buy Agnes a necklace. He followed them back to the town hall, where he left them while Charles and Agnes watched the circus. Back in Pensnett, all was not well. Chambers reported his observations to Benjamin Wood, the People's Warden of St. Mark's, who was his next-door neighbour. Mr. and Mrs. Boggler found out what had happened and threatened legal action. Atherton wrote to the father on March 14th, apologising for his actions, for denying them when first confronted, and for having caused him uneasiness. That letter was made public, and Atherton then wrote to the bishop, setting out the facts. The bishop was actually quite a famous bishop, the Bishop of Litchfield, Bishop Selwyn, the first missionary bishop of New Zealand. Two photos there from 1855 and 1875 showing what being a bishop does to you. Bishop Selwyn instituted a churchwarden's inquiry, which of course involved Benjamin Wood, the People's Warden. And the conclusion was that Atherton was not unworthy of the confidence of the parishioners. This was unsurprisingly felt to be something of a whitewash, and it didn't end there. A more formal inquiry was instituted with some senior clergy in the parish from Wolverhampton, Dudley and Coventry under the Clergy Discipline Act. This inquiry took place in Litchfield, so everyone got on a train at Dudley again and went to the station at Litchfield and thence to the Bishop's Palace in the Close at Litchfield. And it was quite an intimidating affair. There were a lot of folk there from the parish, including Cornelius Chambers, Benjamin Wood, Agnes Boggler and her parents, and the proceedings lasted till about 10 o'clock in the evening. The commission came to the view that though Atherton had acted extremely unwisely, no impropriety had been committed. And the bishop took the view that Atherton should take a break from the parish for a 6-month period and strongly advised him to do so in a letter of May the 27th. But there's another twist to the story. After the event took place, a number of anonymous letters started circulating in the village. The first of these, in April 1870, was entitled "By Their Works Ye Shall Know Them," and they can still be found in the Dudley archives. And this posed a number of questions. Is it a fact that he met her in a certain lane the night previous to going to Birmingham and gave her money to pay for her fare and a note stating the time and place of meeting and parting with kisses and embraces? Yes. Is it a fact that he bought a necklace for her and declared he did not care what he did for those he loved? Yes. Is it a fact they rode together in a cab from the station and that she was to thank him for giving her this ride down so that the cabman might not think anything wrong? Yes. And this is the man who occupies our pulpit. This is the man who takes upon himself the responsibility for ministering to the wants of people. This is the man from whom we might have expected more independence, more straightforwardness, and to have been actuated by motives less selfish, hold up before the people as their pattern in all good things. No doubt these few facts will be denied as previous facts have been in this scandalous affair before, but still they remain facts which cannot be denied. Some of the anonymous letters were in the form of ballads, like this one that we see here, set to well-known music hall tunes. This one has got 8 verses. There was one indeed with 30 verses. And there are a couple of the verses in this particular ballad. And I'll let you have a look at those. They mention both our parson, the model. The ladies all saying, "A beautiful model is he." They also mention someone called Poor Buttons, and Buttons is clearly the name that the writer gave to Benjamin Wood, the church warden, who he regards as guilty as Atherton himself. And perhaps the most telling phrase is that final refrain, "And oh dear, oh, don't all of us know, this parson's religion is nothing but show." These letters didn't stop when Atherton left the parish, but continued when he returned in September. And they continued to come throughout October and November in the form of anonymous letters that were nominally in the form of sermon notices on morality, virtue, truthfulness, harvest, character, charity, and faith. They are very peculiar documents, and you feel as if you're entering the mind of a very odd person indeed when you read them. There are references to Richard Boot and Eliza Brinton, references to necklaces and silver garters, the accusation that Benjamin Wood, Buttons, bought silver garters for Selina Atherton. There are accusations of sexual touching of young ladies whilst decorating church or in the ladies' Bible class. There are scurrilous names given to church members. Agnes is identifiable as someone called Flowing Hair. There's the accusation that Atherton left bills to local shopkeepers unpaid, and several references to leg tickling matches with church members, male and female, as horses and jockeys. And I'll let you imagine what that might be about. One particular letter was chosen by Atherton and indeed the bishop to take liable action against, the sermon on charity. And this particular letter, I think, was chosen because it contains very few references to female members of the parish, who must have been feeling particularly hurt by some of the references in the letters. And if we read some of it, "My dear parishioners, on Sunday next I shall deliver an address on charity. Since my return among you, I have done all the good I possibly could for those who would uphold me in my damnable and lustful practices." We all recollect the fun and stir a short time ago about Mr. Button's daughter being christened, and the admirable repast that was provided at his house for a few friends. The wines were excellent and soon began to tell on the company. Our holy vicar proposed the health of one and another till he was quite done up. This following was the last he tried at. "This is the happiest moment of my life, hic. My curates attend to the church, hic. My wife attends to the curate, hic. and I propose by excellent friend's health, Mr. Cooper, hic, and down he tumbled into his chair, the holy man of God quite drunk and incapable of taking care of himself. An offertory as usual for necklace and silver-buckled partners. Vicar, St. Mark's. The libel case was brought against a stocktaker and the publican at the Lion Inn, John Candlin, for circulating the letter. Full accounts appeared in the local and national press, which contained details of all the earlier events. It was actually adjourned from the local magistrates' court in Brierley Hill because of the size of the crowd, and was finally heard on December the 14th and 23rd in 1870 at Wolverhampton Magistrates' Court, where a very considerable number of people from Pensnett still travelled. The witnesses established that the letter circulated in a number of pubs in early November, in particular the pub called the Swan, and the magistrate accepted that a libel had been committed. Nonetheless, it was settled before parties before further trial, in the hope that the taking of this action would stop the anonymous letters. In that, they weren't wholly successful. Even while the trial was underway, this appeared, the Pensnett Review of 1870, that contained a particularly vicious statement. Why this man got all the evidence which is adduced against the Reverend Boot, and after it was arranged for the curate to be placed there, and the parishioners paid what was owing to them, this treacherous wretch reaped up all the evidence he could get and forced the matter into the divorce court. And why did he do this? Simply because he wanted the living and did not care a fig, neither for the feelings of his friends nor the interests of his parishioners, so he might have it. And now this cowardly poltroon goes skulking about at night, disguised for fear the dear parishioner should recognise him, and if it should so happen that circumstances compel him to come in the daytime, he goes about like a convicted felon. Surely judgment has come to this man in this world for his hellish actions towards his friends, and perhaps a relation, as I said. Not a nice letter at all. The letters eventually petered out in April 1871, and we're left with the question, who wrote them? Alpha? Maybe. A church member? Quite possibly, because the letters betray quite a detailed knowledge of Anglican practice. Someone from the Methodist Church appalled at the fact that Atherton drank alcohol. Maybe Cornelius Chambers. Who knows? It's not knowable at this stage. Interesting to speculate, though. So, the aftermath. What happened to our main protagonists? Well, the census record in 1871, April the 4th, tell us that Charles was at the vicarage with his son and daughter, his mother and his father, but not Selina. Selina was at the house of her sister, Henrietta Baldwin, in Carrington in Nottingham. Was this connected with all that had gone on, or simply a visit in early April? It's hard to know. As regards Agnes, she certainly wasn't at her home address. The 1871 census for Stourbridge for her uncle contains the name Annie Boggler, 17 niece, who is not mentioned in any other census as far as I can see. So that's quite possibly her. But there's another possibility. In the little family tree at the top, I show Benjamin Wood, Buttons, in the letters, who was married to Eliza Bryce. She was the daughter of the former parish clerk, but more importantly, she was the daughter of the schoolmistress at the national school, who would be in some ways her boss. And it's quite possible, I think, that the Bryces arranged for Agnes to be quietly sent away from the parish. In the 1871 census of Cleobury Mortimer, we find an Agnes Bryce as a servant at the home of Francis and Elizabeth Burton, and his 4 daughters and his 2 sons. Rather a Jane Austen touch there. So perhaps this was where Agnes was sent. Perhaps both possibilities are true, and Agnes was actually meant to be at the home of Francis and Elizabeth Burton, but was actually at the home of her uncle in Stourbridge. Again, it's unknowable. Later years? Well, St. Mark's Church, first of all. St. Mark's Church basically entered upon a much more mundane period of existence where the main concerns were the increasing substance that was taking place that required extensive repair, and indeed having continued to do so over the course of the years. Cornelius Chambers, well, he became a Liberal politician. He was a member of the local school board. He was by profession the manager of an ironworks in the Dell in Bromley. And we next read about him in the 1880s, when, as the ironworks manager, he spent a complete lunch hour hiding effectively by the side of the canal, watching 2 of his employees getting paralytic drunk in this pub called The Fish, just by the side of the canal in Bromley. He then reported this to the clergyman, to the constable, who took them to court. Really, Cornelius Chambers does seem to have a gift for hiding and watching. There are other ways that one could describe it, of course. And he naturally thus became a county councillor. Charles and Selina, well, they were at St. Mark's until 1876, and at their leaving do, it was said that if the hearer was told there was a hell and a judgment to come, he was reminded that by the acceptance of the sacrifice once offered, there was a bright hope of immortality in the glorious abode of the spirits of just men made perfect. Truly has Mr. Atherton's career at Pensnett been far from an uneventful one. Selina, we are told, has ever heartily entered into his schemes for improvement and afforded that consolation to him in his hours of unremitting toil, which it is the woman's and above all the true helpmeet's province to impart. I wonder what she thought. But then one can trace their careers through the ecclesiastical records. From 1876 to 1878, he was vicar of Nymphsfield, St. Bartholomew, down in the southwest, where he found time again to write another book, Instructions in the Way of Peace, again still obtainable should you wish to have a copy. He was vicar of Bedminster St. Paul's in Bristol from 1878 to 1885, where in fact the church prospered and grew very significantly under his mission work. He then moved, surprisingly, to St. Lawrence in Yorkshire from 1885 to 1887, because it would seem his health had broken down with the work he was doing in Bedminster. He was rural dean there for a year. But he moved back to Farringdon St. Petrock in 1887, and there he became the missioner of Exeter Cathedral, to where he actually moved in 1889 as a canon, where he stayed for the rest of his life till he died in 1907. And there is actually in the cathedral a memorial to him. And it says, an ardent missioner, did splendid work amongst the colliers. There's again a slightly expanded family tree. His 2 children married. Ernest married to an older lady and had no children. Gertrude married to an army captain and had 3 children, 2 in India and 1 in Chester. The 2 girls who were born in India lived to ripe old ages, dying in the 1970s, 1980s. The son died in 1916 in action in the First World War. Gertrude died in 1916. Selina herself died in 1922. having seen both her child and her grandchild die before her. Agnes, we next meet in 1875 when she married Samuel Edward Wharton in Sheffield. Sam Wharton was a former pupil teacher at the British School, a member of St. James's Methodist Chapel. So in the light of the good Anglicans in Pensnich Parish, Agnes committed the double sin of marrying a Methodist. From 1881 to 1911, she was schoolmistress in Halifax and Eland in Yorkshire, and her husband was a schoolmaster. They had 5 children with names Frederick, Adelina, Ralph, Bertrand and Percival that were probably not typical names for minors in Pensnich at the time. Adelina Minnie we'll hear a little more about in a moment. We have pictures. There's Sam playing the organ. He was a noted concert organist and travelled round Yorkshire quite significantly. And there we have a picture of them, possibly at their honeymoon in Blackpool. But one other point. The sharp-eyed amongst you will have noticed that when Charles Atherton was at Snaith St. Lawrence in 1885, he was really quite close to Agnes Wharton. This was the case then. And the family, the descendants of Agnes and Sam, actually say that Minnie, Adelina, reported that Agnes had a couple of gold rings and a diamond pendant that had been given her to by one Uncle Charlie, so that she would have something to fall back on if she ever needed money. As far as one can tell, there is no Uncle Charlie in the family. So we're left with questions. Who wrote the anonymous letters? How and where did Agnes and Edward meet to be married in Sheffield in 1875? Did Francis Burlton ever find husbands for his 4 daughters? And who was Uncle Charlie? I hope you enjoyed this story, and thank you for listening.